I want to thank you very much for being a part of the audience for this series, In a Family Way. At the end of this conversation, we're going to be opening up the floor to hear your questions. To thank you for participating, we're going to have a random drawing for one $25 gift card. And we really look forward to hearing what your questions are and finding the very best answers just for you. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is actually our final session of our series, In a Family Way. So if you haven't seen earlier sessions, they're going to be recorded and available on our YouTube channel for Pueblo Department of Public Health and Environment. They're also on our Facebook page. So I encourage you, if you want more information about the resources available here in Pueblo and the ideas surrounding a healthy pregnancy and early bonding with your newborn, I'd like you to check out In a Family Way. We have a really amazing program because of the development that's taken place with our expert, Christy Phillips. Christy is a licensed clinical social worker and an infant mental health specialist. And she's here to help us look at that early period between a parent and their newborn. And we're calling it Family Patterns in Parenting, the Ghosts and the Angels in the Nursery. Christy, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I am always excited anytime I have an opportunity to talk about infant mental health. It is a newer specialty. It hasn't been around very long, but it's very, very important to everyone. It really addresses the patterns that develop from one generation to the other and how that affects the infants that we're raising in our generation now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do want to start by talking a little bit about, there's two articles that are really important to the foundation of infant mental health. I'm going to share my screen briefly while we talk about them. So the first one that I want to talk about is there's an article called Ghost in the Nursery. And Ghost in the Nursery was published by Selma Freiberg. It was published in 1975. And so that is about when infant mental health started to really come to the surface, where people were wondering, what about the baby? And so Ghost in the Nursery, these are some of the key points that come out of it that are really important to the work that we do today. And so the ghost represents the moments where a child experiences fear, trauma, sorrow, feeling unloved and unprotected. And it does not necessarily refer to a person. So it's not about your caregiver or your parent or grandparent, but it's really about the experiences or patterns that develop over infancy and childhood. A lot of times, because of these experiences are happening when we're infants, that trauma is stored in a subconscious way. So we don't necessarily have language to store it and be able to access that as a memory now that we might be an adult. So it's stored in our body as a muscle memory or an emotion that might be triggered, and we don't understand what's happening. And so sometimes we might be triggered to feel a certain way and we're totally confused. Where did that come from? And it could be something that happened to us before we were verbal. So it's stored in our body. So when we're talking about infant trauma and we're talking about ghost in the nursery and these patterns in parenting, sometimes we don't have access to a lot of these memories because it's pre-verbal. Another thing to really note about this is that we create patterns in parenting that are carried on, and it happens from generation to generation. And so when we're talking about a lot of those ghosts in the nursery, as they refer to these moments, it could be those patterns and those moments that are passed on from generation to generation. And so when an infant is experiencing that kind of trauma, it may not be just about here and now and the stress of the situation. It was how your grandmother handled stress, and her mother handled stress, and her mother. And so we're talking about several generations of this being passed down. So the next one that I want to talk about that is also very important. So first was The Ghost in the Nursery, that was published in 1975. And then it was followed up by Angels in the Nursery by Alicia Lieberman. And so Alicia was actually a student for Selma, and she published this in 2005. And so when we're talking about how recent a lot of this research is and a lot of these publications, 2005 feels like yesterday. Like it just feels like it's happening right now. That's how recent. And so Alicia continued to take Salma's work, and it evolved. And so she expanded on that. And she said that there are also angels in the nursery. And the angels represent those moments when a child feels loved, feels protected, and feels safe. And so often caregivers may not have memories of feeling loved and safe in their childhood. And so it does happen sometimes where the trauma is so significant in somebody's childhood that they can sit and think and think and think, and they can't remember one time that they felt loved. And so sometimes that might mean that it's locked in their subconscious, where they may not have ready access to it, and that might come along later. But in those moments where there really isn't a moment that someone can draw on, that's when Alicia says that you can become your own angel. And that's when you create your own angel moments. And I really love that concept. So the parenthood offers new opportunities to resolve those patterns and to heal some of those wounds that have been passed down from generation to generation. And we'll end up creating our own angel moments. And we change that narrative for our own children. And so we now become angels for our infants. So when they become adults and they're going, back into that life cycle of the angels and the ghosts in the nursery, we are the angel for them. And so, we have an opportunity at any time to change this narrative and to become that healing angel for our own children. So I feel like addressing these two articles are really important to carry a conversation about what now. And so, we're talking about families who are getting ready to have babies, and, this concept might be new to them about the idea of having ghosts in the nursery and angels in the nursery.
For sure. Yeah. I think sometimes people, particularly those that maybe are coming from active substance use, maybe even living in multi-generational households when they come home from the hospital with their newborn. And it may actually even be a physical presence of more than one generation caring for this new infant, and for that mother trying to find her own way and her own voice and the way she wants to interact with her baby. But I love the idea that we can take moments. So it doesn't have to be like every day, all the time, in every circumstance, but we're creating moments of strength and connection and love and support for our infant that will actually serve them, you're saying, all the way forward at some point in the future where they may themselves become parents.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And, and I think what happens for all parents, so it doesn't matter, who we're talking about, the way that we were parented is so deeply ingrained into us that we can be very thoughtful and plan on never doing this, whatever it is. We're never going to do that when we become parents. And without even thinking, it just comes out. I like to tell the story of when my daughter was young. She was probably about 4 years old, and she had her arms tucked into her coat, and she was running through the store. And I said, Mariah, don't run. You're going to fall and get hurt. And she didn't listen, and she continued to run. And what do you think happened? Of course, she fell and she got hurt. And the very first thing that came out of my mouth, I said, "Por te gusta." And I was shocked because I don't even speak Spanish. But my mom spoke Spanish. And in that moment, I remembered that is what she used to say to me. So basically what it means, it's a very unempathetic way to respond. And what it means is that's what you get. So, it's the idea, I told you, you didn't listen, and now you're hurt. That's what you get. And so it's the idea that in that moment, I became my mom. And without even thinking about it, it just came out, even in another language, a language that I don't speak. And so it happens to all of us. And so I really like that you point out that it's a moment. And so just because in that moment, I allowed myself to repeat a pattern of not being empathetic when Mariah was crying. She had fallen and got hurt and she was crying. And I did not respond in an empathetic way, even though that was my plan as a parent. I wanted to be a better parent and be thoughtful and validate her feelings when she was hurt. And it just came out. But that was just one moment. And so as I continued to grow, there were lots more moments to change that narrative. And so, we have opportunity after opportunity. And even if we missed that one, if we didn't act in an intentional way, the way that we wanted to, it's okay. It's okay because you just keep going.
That is really important to remember. I'm wondering too, when I'm thinking about you saying that we create angel moments. So it seems as a new parent that if we don't have that well of compassion, support, self-worth that we're coming from, how do we cultivate that for ourselves? Because I'm thinking about, before you have language and the baby is crying and you're not sure what they're saying and you want to respond, but you yourself kind of have a deficit too. Are there things that this new parent can do, and maybe they do it before the birth? Are there things that they could do in preparation of being a parent that kind of builds that well of resiliency?
So there are so many answers to this question. There's like so many different ways. And so, yes, there's always things that you can do to prepare. But the reality is that a lot of the things that are going to happen, you don't know it's going to happen until you're triggered. So that when we're talking about things that are unconscious, you didn't know that your baby crying or being inconsolable was going to be such a big trigger because maybe it's never happened before. What's really interesting is, and I want to remember correctly, I want to say it came out of Ghost in the Nursery, out of that article, where they did tell a story. It kind of follows the clinical process of a young mom. And one of the things that was really hard for her was the baby was crying and the baby needed her, and she just carried on and she didn't respond. And she was becoming very frustrated herself and, agitated, like, oh, she won't stop crying. And that helped to start a new narrative for mom to think about what was it like for her when she was the infant and she was crying, and who came to her and made it better. And
Mm.
so it's really starting this new narrative of thinking about what is contributing to this high level of frustration, and knowing that there's a really good chance that having that level of intolerance to an infant crying, it could have a lot to do with the fact that maybe when they were the infant and they were crying, that the other people, their caregivers or the people who are around them, were very frustrated and didn't know what to do. And so they did not respond in a way that was calm and loving, and created that angel moment for that baby. And so if that was the pattern that was repeated, that's what's been triggered. And in that moment, so it's not about that mom not being a good mom. So that's what the first thing that new moms will do, is they'll internalize it and they'll blame themselves, and they say, what mom gets triggered by their own child crying? Like, am I a bad mom? And the answer is no. No, they're not a bad mom. We're like now starting to touch on some of these intergenerational or repeated patterns of trauma. And so, we don't know what happened when she was an infant. And so we have to empathize. Now we show empathy for this mom who's struggling in the moment, and saying it's okay. And you can be there, and we can create new moments. And I think that that's one of the first steps when we talk about what do we do in that moment. What if you're the parent who can't cope with that crying? The first thing is to acknowledge it, kind of acknowledge it, and be aware that there's a reason why she's triggered,
Mm.
and start to love herself, and know that she needs healing. Like, this is her moment to heal. And when that moment arrives, part of that mom's healing means changing the pattern by responding in a different way. And so starting to hear that baby cry, and stop disassociating yourself or separating yourself from that stressful moment and saying, I just can't deal with this anymore. I'm just not going to deal with it. Use that as an opportunity to say, wait a minute, somebody didn't answer my cry, but I'm not going to do that for you. I'm going to answer your cry. And so it's a totally different way of processing, and saying, I acknowledge that somebody didn't do this for me, but I'm going to change the narrative, and I'm going to make a different choice and be there.
Boy, that's really strong. That's really strong. That I can see how that would change the mother's experience and give her more confidence for the next time the baby cries. So babies are tricky because they are pre-verbal. Like, they aren't saying, I'm hungry. They aren't saying, I'm cold. So is there like I'm very systematic in the way I think. Is there like a list that a new mom could go down and think about, well, okay, my baby's crying. I want to respond. I don't want to disassociate or disconnect from my baby and walk out of the room and say, this is a bad time for me. But how? How do we interpret the cry? Is there like 4 or 5 things that we could like run down to check on that little tiny person to see if it's an easy fix? Because they're not complicated. They're just demanding.
Yes, and it happens. It's that cycle that happens over and over and over every day. And so, and it's a very important cycle too. So I think that's the other thing, is that, we have to know that this cycle of the baby has a need, the baby cries, somebody responds, they make it better, life is good. And then the baby has a need, like it'll just happen over and over and over. And this is a really important, it's one of the most important first cycles where the baby is learning from. So the baby is learning cause and effect. So the baby's learning, if I cry, somebody will respond, they're going to make it better. The other thing is the baby's learning to trust. They trust that if something's wrong, and if I need my mom, if I just cry out, my mom is going to come, and I trust her. I trust her to come and make it better. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about an actual list, you know, sometimes that list might vary based on your kind of your gut. And so we always want to respond, you know, when we're talking about an infant, especially if the infant is younger than 12 months, it's always going to be a need. That baby needs you. And so we're going to respond. There's that regular list of, you know, do they need a new diaper? Do they, are they hungry? Should we feed them? But then we can start expanding it to other things that are a little bit more specific to the room and the situation. So we often forget that babies are very sensitive and they become easily overwhelmed. And so if in that moment that we're having a hard time calming our baby down, we have to kind of do a check, kind of an inventory of what's happening around me. The first thing is myself as the parent. Am I frustrated? And, you know, what do I need to do to bring that calm regulation into the situation? Because the baby's going to mirror what I am feeling. So if I'm coming in and I'm agitated or I'm frustrated and angry, then the baby is going to match that, and we're going to feed off of each other, and nobody's calming down.
Oh,
Nothing's
gosh.
getting better. And so that's the first thing, is we have to check ourselves. We have to look at our own regulation and know that the baby's going to match it. The other thing is we're going to take that inventory of the room. Is there too much noise? Is there too much light? Is there anything else that could be overwhelming for the baby? And so once we take care of that, and let's say the baby's still fussy, maybe the baby just wants to be held. Maybe they're just seeking that connectedness. And so they just want to be held and cuddled. And that's important too. You know, responding to the need of wanting to be close to their mom is just as important as the other needs of changing their diaper and feeding them. They need that closeness to be close to their mom. And so, you know, those are the kinds of things. But I think it's easy to forget that for mom to check her own self-regulation and make sure she's calm. And then it's easy to forget the rest of the room. And it becomes more of a challenge if you have other children. So let's say you have toddlers and they're, you know, they're playing and having fun, and it's loud. And so that can create a challenge. So we just have to be aware that sometimes the baby won't calm down unless we move them to a different room where it can be quiet and calm.
Mm-hmm. And I guess sometimes like those carriers can be really easy, because then you can slip the baby in the carrier and you can still be hands-free and continue
Absolutely.
on. Yeah.
Yes. And there's so many options for those kinds of carriers these days. They're, you know, but the idea that they're close to mommy, they can hear the heartbeat, they can smell the mom, and they can just feel that closeness. It's really important to that bonding and attachment.
That sounds comforting. I'm comforted by that. And I guess it's that sense of connection and safety and protectiveness that gives them the space that if they're tired, then they can maybe drop off to sleep and get the rest that they need, so they're not so overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. Yeah. So I read something about the frustration and confusion, and it sounds like, you know, you spoke to it a little bit just now, like checking in with how am I feeling? Like maybe I had a phone call with somebody over a bill and it left me feeling really frustrated and maybe even confused, like how am I going to meet the criteria that they told me I have to do to keep my lights on? But it also goes to the baby. Like the baby has a real easy time of becoming frustrated and confused as well. But it's that link between mom and baby. So how do we lower that for both mom and baby in 20 words or less?
Yes. So really what you're referring to, it's called the mirroring phenomenon. And so studies have showed that infants will mirror what's happening. They'll mirror their caregiver. And so that's one of the reasons why depression is a real concern for new infants and new moms, because if a mom is depressed, the baby will mirror that depression. And so that concept can be used in any situation. So you're talking about a situation where a mom is angry or scared or frustrated in that moment, and the baby is picking that up and mirroring that. And so those are those moments when it feels like the moment when I'm the most frustrated and I might have the least amount of energy. That's when the baby, they need me the most. Their level of need goes up in that moment, and it becomes the most challenging. And it's because of this cycle. And so that's when we really have to remember that one of the main triggers in those moments is the energy that I'm bringing into the room. And so the best thing in those situations, because life happens, we're all going to get those phone calls that we leave upset and fearful and angry. And so we have to start practicing our ability to self-regulate. And so when I talk about self-regulation, I talk about being calm. So, I have to work on being able to calm myself down to a point where, yes, I understand this is an issue and it's a stressor and we will get to it, but I'm not going to allow that to ruin my whole day. I'm not going to let that spill over onto my family and my children. And so some of the things that you can do to help with that: number one, breathe. Just breathe. When we are stressed out, we have a tendency to hold our breath.
Right.
And when we look at, the way that our body functions, when we hold our breath, we're withholding oxygen from our brain. And so our brain, in order for our brain to be healthy and to be able to problem solve and be effective and think, it needs oxygen. And so in those moments, we have to be very purposeful about breathing. And so this is something that you can even do with your baby, because, let's say they're already picking up on this frustration and they're starting to feel it. Hold your baby, hold them really close, take a deep breath, count 1, 2, 3, and relax. And you just do that. Just focus on your breathing while holding your baby, and your baby's going to pick up on that breathing, and then they're going to start breathing. And then their little brains are also going to get an increase of oxygen, and it's going to help to calm them down. And
that's a good strategy. I can use that even though I don't have a baby anymore. Yeah.
Yes. But I do try to be real. And so I do know that there are going to be times when whatever's going on is so stressful that I can't bring myself down. I can't regulate, and I can't be present in that moment to help my child. And so if there's ever a time when it becomes a safety issue where, I'm just not present enough, I do tell families I would much rather them lay their child down in their crib or a bassinet and walk away for 5 minutes. Just go breathe for 5 minutes and then come back. Because when we talk about this cycle of, the baby's escalating because we're escalating, and we're escalating because the baby's escalating, nobody's getting better. And so in that moment, if that is the only thing you can do, that is the only tool you've got left, I would much rather see you try that than run the risk of an infant getting hurt.
Awesome. Because I have heard that before, where you just, you give yourself permission to take a break. And like you say, that's one of the strategies in your toolkit. It's not the first one, but
absolutely. That's the last thing. Like I said, if nothing else works, if you tried breathing, that didn't work. If maybe even distraction, moving them to a different activity, moving them to a different room so they can focus on something else while you work on pulling yourself together and coping. If that doesn't work, offering a comfort item like a soft blanket or a pacifier, if that doesn't work. So, there are these lists of things that you can try to offer comfort. And if the baby continues to get more and more upset and you can't think of anything else and you're getting upset to a point where you're worried about your ability to stay calm, then that's when you pull on that tool.
Thank you. Thank you for really identifying that. I want to go back to this idea about the multi-generational aspect of how, it's not what we know in terms of even memory, you're saying. It can live in our bodies and it can be at a subconscious level. But there was a quote that I really loved, because when you start thinking about things being subconscious, you kind of feel like, well, there's no way but to express it. But history is not destiny. So just because it happened before really does not mean it has to continue. You make a value judgment. Is this what I want to have as a part of my life and the life of my family? And if it's something that inspires and brings you closer together and strengthens you, then, that's an easy yes. But if it's something that is causing strife or causing you to feel bad about yourself as a parent, well, clearly, let's find strategies to learn a different way to do it. And that's what you're helping us with today. I also read that those key triggering times were like when you go to feed your child, and maybe it's even when they get into the high chair or they're starting to learn to feed themselves, their sleep cycles. And, do you get up every time they get up in the night? And maybe that's related to their age. Are they waking because they have a soiled diaper? Or are they waking because they're hungry? Are they waking because they're cold? That kind of thing. Then an older child, it would be the toilet training. And again, probably the older child discipline, because discipline isn't something that we would use with an infant, somebody under a year old, is it?
Oh, no. And the concept of discipline, consequences, and punishment, that doesn't really come into play. It doesn't make sense from a developmental perspective until they're 3, like all the way up till they're 3. And what's interesting, as a infant mental health specialist, I specifically work with children birth to 3, and it is very, very common that when I first start to work with the family, that they are using, with say a 2-year-old, they're using the concepts of punishment and consequences. But the reality is the way that the brain functions, the way, where the brain is developed to at that point, the baby doesn't understand. A 2-year-old doesn't understand that level of consequence or that level of punishment. And it really does, it becomes their main job. So, I try to help families understand, even if the baby did make a bad choice, what if because they do test limits. So they're testing limits, but even though the consequences are not always appropriate. So let's say they are testing limits and they are making difficult choices. In that moment, when they're tantruming and when they're struggling, the only thing to do in that moment is to support them to calm down. It's called self-regulation. That's the most important thing to learn. And just the same way that I might talk about an infant, where we need to look at what's going on in the room, we need to be present, we need to know where we are in terms of, are we calm, are we frustrated, are we angry and annoyed? Because we have to be the calm one, because they're going to regulate off of us. And so in that moment, I call it a time in, is what I don't like to use time out, because it doesn't make sense for a toddler. So I call it a time in. That's where the parent goes with the child into the room, and their only job is to regulate. And whatever it takes, even if that means holding them and loving them, singing to them, sometimes blowing bubbles or breathing, doing things to help bring that frustration down. It seems a little counterintuitive because people are saying, well, they just did this and we're going to reward them with that kind of attention and a fun activity. And we have to stop looking at love and that attention as a reward. That our children need that, especially when they're struggling. And so we have to kind of change the way that we look at that and kind of redefine it, that if the baby is tantruming and struggling in that moment, it is our love that they need. It is, it is that connection that they need. And so going to another room with them and being calm and doing whatever we can as a parent to help them create that angel moment. Those are the opportunities for the angel moments, is, by holding them and rocking them and doing, loving things to help them calm down to where we can start learning again. And so, you had talked about those times, like the feedings, the tantrums, the nighttime, why are those the most difficult times?
Mm-hmm.
And, the way, when you talk about those, I think of those as being some of the most stressful times. And there's probably a higher chance that when we're talking about the ghost in the nursery, so those moments where a child may have not received the care that they needed and they didn't feel loved and they didn't feel cared for, they could have been around those moments. It could have been when they were hungry and that caregiver didn't feed them when they needed to get fed, or when at nighttime, well, there's lots of reasons a baby might wake up at night. They might be afraid, they might be uncomfortable, they might be hungry. And so nighttime becomes another trigger where we might respond with frustration and anger, but not realizing that, when this parent was a baby, how did their parent respond? Is this a pattern that was so deeply ingrained they didn't even know?
Right.
And so awareness, becoming aware and knowing that those times when they feel the most frustrated, this is an opportunity to change the narrative and create angel moments for themselves to heal that moment, but also for their children.
Wow. You're pretty smart. You're actually giving us really it made me think of something when my oldest son, he had to have been about 2, and we had a big dog. I mean, she was a German Shepherd mix, Malamute. And he was outside and I could hear him laughing and just being gleeful. And then it would quiet down. And then it would be this chuckling glee again. And I looked out the kitchen window, like, what are you doing? And he had like a little stick. And she was laying down, and he would take the stick and he would hit her like right between the eyes, and she would squint her face up. And he thought that was hilarious. And he was just cracking up. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I went out there and, it's like, no, we have to be gentle with her. And, we talked about how to treat the dog, but the dog, I mean, we were really blessed because the dog was very patient. And of course, at 2, he wasn't hurting her. But it was, one of those moments as a parent, it was like, oh, what are you doing to our beloved pet? But at the same time, it was that moment of, they were playing, whatever that was, they were playing, and, just reframing it to say, well, this is play, but we can play more gently than hitting the dog with a stick.
And thinking about this story and like all the other stories that are similar, how different that could have looked. You could have ran out and yelled at him and how do you like it? I've seen so many different responses to those, but it's an opportunity. And it sounds like you use that as an opportunity to role model empathy. And so when a child is around 2, this is the perfect time to start teaching empathy. And that's through role modeling. So we show them empathy, and then reinforcing it too. So when they show empathy towards another child or an animal, or, that's when we really reinforce it and let them know that, yes, we do care about each other. And so what a great story. And I love how you responded, and that you showed him empathy and understood he was just 2 and he thought he was having fun.
And I was really lucky. We had a great dog. But this also makes me think of another story. So I was a student in a sociology class. And sociology, it's like the study of these human systems and our expectations and the way we function. And there was a young woman who had a young son, and she went to a family barbecue with the baby. And one of the older cousins or uncles thought it was hilarious. He took his beer and he gave it to her 2-year-old to sip. And she was very upset. And, it resulted in her leaving the family barbecue and, telling this uncle, that's it. You're not going to be around, my son if this is the way you're going to treat him. Well, she brought it up in the sociology class. And the instructor actually said to her, your family relations are more important than anything else. And you should go back and you should apologize to that uncle because he meant your baby no harm. He was just showing him the way we treat one another. We share what we have with our families. And I'm like going, ah! And it happened here in Pueblo. I mean, it was something that happened in Pueblo, and I've never forgotten that. Because I didn't go up to that mother afterwards and say, you were right. You followed your intuition and your protectiveness of your child because you knew that was not something for them. And so I've always regretted that was a missed opportunity for me. But how does somebody 20 years old, brand new mom, deal with not just a ghost, but I mean, a real flesh and blood person who she has a family tie with? How would she do with something like that?
Yeah. I mean, and that just, those kinds of things make my heart hurt. Like, I just feel for that mom in that story because I know that it happens. You even mentioned situations where families are living together. So what if she was living with that uncle and she couldn't get away? Like, what then?
Yeah.
And that those situations are really, really difficult because you've got one person who's trying to change the narrative. And so, what your sociology teacher was talking about is, they're really referring to maybe the patterns and the tradition of a family. And maybe, to me, he's telling me the uncle didn't know well enough that you shouldn't give a 2-year-old beer. Who doesn't know that you shouldn't give a 2-year-old beer so that was one of the things I thought about. But there are patterns. That's an example of pattern. And and I don't know about this young mom, but those kinds of things that they try to normalize that are clearly not okay. They try to normalize it, and who knows how deep that went. Where did that start? Where children and infants or toddlers it was okay to give them alcohol, or I'll even expand it. At what point was a child exposed to even observing any kind of use, whether it's alcohol or drugs? Because chances are, if somebody tries to sit and think about that, it probably goes generations. Like, it didn't just happen. That didn't just start at that one picnic. It probably happened for generations. And so what's really hard is that mom, she has the power to say no, not for my child. Like I understand that you may have given beer to your kids and you made that choice, but I'm making a different choice. I'm going to create a new narrative for my family. And so all moms have the opportunity to make a choice, to make a better choice than what maybe was made for them when they were young. And so it's an opportunity to change that pattern, change the narrative, and to also have empathy for themselves. Because, you know, let's just pretend for that mom that maybe alcohol might have been a problem for the family. Like maybe there could have been an issue. Maybe that would have been her aha moment that, wait a minute, you know, this was introduced to me when I was way too young, and it wasn't fair. And, you know, and maybe that was a moment for a parent to start having empathy for themselves too, and say, I didn't just wake up one day and decide to, you know, to use alcohol as a way to cope, or to use drugs as a way to cope. You know, it was probably introduced several generations ago, and it just trickled down into my past. And so that's a turning point. Like when I talk about, you know, my heart being heavy, that's a turning point. So she's making a choice not only to heal for herself, but she's creating new patterns and new narratives. She's creating angel moments for her babies. And I know that's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy because she was the first one who made a choice. And, you know, sometimes the answer is to say, I don't want you around my child. Like, you know, you can make that separation. And if that's what was good for that mom, then she should have been supported in that decision. Sometimes you have to make a decision with somebody who is much closer. Just to kind of share a story from my own experience. When I grew up, my mom, she was a very hard worker, She worked an 8-hour job, and then she owned a business where she sold jewelry and gifts. And so she would work an 8-hour day, and then she would leave and go to people's homes and have parties where she would set up all of her items, and then, you know, she would make more money that way. The party would last all night long, and sometimes she wouldn't come home until it was very, very late. And so an entire day could go by where we didn't get to see our mom because she was working. Wow. And that became the pattern. And just to let you know, she did that because she grew up in extreme poverty. She grew up in such poverty that they, you know, she didn't have clothes that fit, or, you know, maybe she owned 2 dresses that she could alternate. And so she made the decision, my children will not grow up in poverty. And so she decided to change that. So she became a very hard worker. And the thing is that she kind of overdid it because we had everything. We were a very typical middle-class family, and we were spoiled, you know, to say the least. If we wanted a toy, we got it. If we wanted new clothes, we got it. And so we were very well taken care of, but it was at the expense of having that time with my mom. Yeah. And so I decided as a child, I'm going to change that narrative. And so I have empathy, and I understood, and I loved my mom very much, and I appreciated the sacrifice that she made. I did not want to make that same level of sacrifice for my own kids. I wanted to raise them. And so I changed the narrative, and my mom, we kind of came to a head where I worked a full-time job, and she wanted me to start going on my days off to sell jewelry with her. And, you know, she really guilted me. She needed me, you know, she couldn't do it without me. And I had to explain to her that how hard it was for me to not have her around growing up, and that I was going to make a decision. And I told her I will work one job, and then I will be the one raising my daughter. Because she said, well, you know, your mother-in-law, her other grandma can watch her, or her auntie can watch her. And I said, no, it's my day off, and I am at work all week. This is my time with Mariah, and I'm going to value that. And so she was very hurt because, you know, I don't think she understood why I needed to set a boundary, but I set the limit and I stuck to it. And so, you know, our relationship, you know, it was kind of hard at first, and she was sad. But it was okay. She came to understand and accept that that was my limit, and everything was fine. And I kept to that word. I kept true to that word. I had one job and I spent as much time as I could with my kids. And so that's an example of changing the narrative. Like, there's something you didn't like and you changed it. And sometimes you have to have a hard conversation with family members so they know why you're making that choice and why it's important.
So it is okay to have boundaries. And it
Absolutely.
is okay to make those, cultural shifts towards something. I always say, what do I want more of and what do I want less of? And really make a conscious decision about, cultivating what I want more of. And since we're in a time of COVID right now, one of the things that I've decided is I'm not going to call it social distancing. I'm going to call it physical distancing, because we're physically distancing from one another, but we're socially connected. Like, I had conversations yesterday with people from 8 feet apart or texting or on the phone, and it made me feel so happy. I just felt happier than I felt in a really long time because I've missed being around people. So I think it's really interesting when we think about our own experience as a child and what we want to bring to the children that we have, and how sometimes we can almost go to polar opposites and trying to find that balance. I was listening to your story and thinking about, myself, and my mother died when I was really young. So I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. And I was really lucky because my husband supported that. And so we had to live and make decisions based on what we could afford on one income. But I got to stay home with my kids, and I got to, just shadow them for, probably from their perspective, way too many years, because I was always in their schools and doing lots of things. But it was healing for me. It healed me for having missed those mother moments in my lifetime. And so then I was able to be the mother that, cooking. It was the big deal was food. Every breakfast I made whatever they wanted. And it's really cute because now as adults, that's one of the memories they have. That was one of the good things in life. We're kind of getting actually close to our time, and I want to make sure that I give you this opportunity to be sure to express that one thing you really, really, really want our audience of new, young mothers that are transitioning from a time of maybe substance use into a time of recovery, and into their parenting. What is that one thing that you really, really want them to know?
So what I think is really important is for moms to really understand that there's no such thing as a perfect mom. There's no such thing as a perfect parent. And we beat ourselves up about it all the time because we think we weren't as perfect as a parent as, maybe somebody down the street. But the reality is that everybody, even the mom down the street, everybody has good days and everybody has hard days. And I like to think of it as one of those paint chips that you pick up for free at the store where, on one end it's white and on one end it's black. And then there's the progression that's the white to the gray, to the darker, to the darker, to the black. I'd like to think of it like that, where there are hardly days where we're completely white, where we are just absolutely perfect and we did everything right to what we believe is right.
Mhm.
And there's hardly any days where we're completely black, where we did everything wrong and we did some real damage. And, now my child is traumatized. That usually doesn't happen. We're usually somewhere in the middle. And, some days we're a little bit lighter gray, other days we're a little bit darker gray, and that is okay. That is every parent's experience. And it's okay to be human and to know that you don't have to be perfect. The whole goal is to just do the best you can with what you've got,
Mhm.
and know that nobody's perfect. And the more you try to compare yourself to people who you think are perfect, know that they're not perfect. They're just showing you something that is perfect, but that's not their real life. It doesn't exist. The perfection does not exist. It's all gray.
That is really great. I think the comparative mind is like our mortal enemy. Like when we really compare our lives to others, it's that whole, the grass is always greener. But,
Absolutely.
let's just put fertilizer on our own grass and water it and, you know, pull the weeds every once in a while, and then we can go lay underneath the trees and watch the sun and the clouds and giggle about the things that we see in the sky. But
Absolutely.
yeah, well, this has been really wonderful. I've loved having your wisdom about parenting and looking at things from the perspective of an infant, because it's not something we typically study or understand, and it seems so foundational but not necessarily intuitive. Like we don't really just know how to be a mother, because we do have those ghosts and the angels, but we can remember to be our own angels and the angels for our babies. So
Absolutely.
I'm thinking there's going to be some questions that might come up from our audience. Are you able to stay with us a little while, and we can go into the chat and make sure people have resources and be able to answer some of the questions that they might have?
Oh, definitely. I am available. And even if others want to reach out, I'll make sure that I have my information for Colorado Blue Sky for developmental testing there.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Oh, that makes me think of something. What do you think about, like a lot of moms today, like life is really frantic in terms of the pace, using an app like Milestone Moments for kind of knowing what's coming up for their baby as they develop in time, because they can put in like the date the baby was born. And I understand the app can push out like, oh, at 3 months they will be doing, turning over, or 6 months it's sitting up. Is that something that you like? Is it something helpful, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I love that it prompts, it automatically prompts you. So even though we're not always thinking about child development, when we have a nice little reminder or a prompt, it brings us back to that subject. And when we do developmental testing, obviously we do come across situations where, there is a significant delay and services are needed. But it's also really common that we find that it's not that the child doesn't have the ability to do a certain function, it's that they haven't had the opportunity. And so when we think about, what do we need to do to help a child grow and develop, play with your child. Play
Ah,
with them every day, get on the floor, connect with them. Those are the things that are going to help them develop the most. And when you have these little prompts to tell you like, oh, don't forget, like they should be rolling over now, like that's going to give you an idea of the way you should be playing with them. So play little games where you roll around, or play games where maybe you're holding a toy just out of their reach so they can roll that way and reach for it. And so when a family's worried about it, that's one thing that I want to make sure is that you're giving them lots of opportunities to practice practice and build a skill. And using those kinds of apps and resources are perfect.
Well, cool. Okay, well, we'll definitely have this in the chat then. So look for that, you guys. Thank you. Thank you so very much for your time and your commitment to families and just the willingness to share your own life and examples. That's so wonderful. Christy, it's been great to talk to you, and thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Okay, guys, so let us know what your questions are, and we'll keep this good conversation going.